we're all good here. And thank you for updating my university. I was, as introduced by Kawakita-san, I was doing my research for, I have been doing my research for like 9 years in the University of Tokyo, and I just moved to, before changing the logo, I think I first introduced my name first. I'm Wen, and sometimes I want people to remember my name. I would say that many of you might know very famous drama, Doctor Who, and there was a new movie about it. And I would say that I am not Doctor Who, but I am Dr. Wen. So yeah, I love that smiling face. And as introduced by Kawakita-san, I just moved from the University of Tokyo to Rikkyo University to start my own lab. And sadly, after the moving, I was not able to access my U-Tokyo account and lost the email address I have been using for like more than 9 years. But I still could receive emails forwarding to the new email. And today, I would like to talk about our research, which like most of the part has been done in the University of Tokyo. It's about the explorative role in our perception and action. And first, about sense of agency. And the definition is quite simple. It's a subject feeling of controlling one's own actions and through the external events. And here actually contains 2 layers of meaning. The first one is about the embodied sense of agency, which means that we will feel that we are the one who controls our own actions. And the other one is about the external world. And it's more complicated, that it's less robust, but people are very clever to learn to detect the association between their own actions and the events in the outside world. And even in very young, very early age infant, you can see some actions that they show that they notice there's a link between the actions and between what they have done and the events happening around them. And there was a study from Rowe in 1969. They showed that when there's a string connecting a mobile with the infant's link, and this very simple setup significantly increased the frequency of infants' lap movement. And I searched on the internet and luckily to find a small YouTube video which was taken in 1995, and this infant is adult right now, and I'm trying to play it. And you can see there's a string connecting to the baby's leg, but the baby did not move the leg a lot, even when there was a string. That the string doesn't really matter if it doesn't cause any change. And using this setup, I'm going to move this forward a little bit. And after the parents putting the mobile to the other end of the string, and after a few minutes, like the baby somehow noticed that the string is connected to his leg, and Jeffrey was able to moving the mobile a lot by kicking the legs, and you can see from the baby face that he obviously noticed the relationship of his own body movement and start to kick a lot. And this is the very it's very interesting and very cute. And we can see that people have the ability to detect actual events, and actually it plays a lot. It plays an important role in our behaviors and how we interact with the world and how we find out what we can do to the world. And let's back to the research on sense of agency. And So many of you might already read some of the papers that in many of the papers, people design some tasks and just most of them directly ask the participant, how do you feel with your control? And can you rate it with like 100 points or just 1 point? And this type of like judgment people have to make basing on some evidence. And this makes me doubt a lot that what exactly sense of vision is. Is this a judgment that we have to give a score for, or the subject feeling, or is this a feeling that we don't really think a lot? Like, for example, the embodied sense of vision, we don't doubt about our control of our feelings. And for when we move the mouse, we don't really think a lot about where the cursor could be. We just like move it without much attention. But in some other papers, including some of my own one, I was thinking about, and the other authors were thinking about the different cues in different levels and how people would review their evidence and to come to a conclusion about sense of agency. It's just influence basing on different like basing on the weightings of different influence, or is something that you have to make a correct or incorrect judgment, or is that a kind of bias that someone always thinks that they're in a very good control over the world, or while someone the other people do not, or is that just the illusion that we feel that our intention come earlier than the event, so that we feel that we are in control. So many of those concepts actually mixed together in this field, making it really hard to understand the connections among them. And however, that this issue does not bother me anymore, because like what interests me the most about the sense of agency is not how we measure it, but it's how it affects our perceptions and behaviors. And like our control over the events in the environment is physical, is true. There must be some control there. We can ensure that we can design and manipulate that. When the control exists, and when people notice, when people detect their control, or they become aware of their control, like how they change their behaviors, or how it could affect their perceptions around the world. This is the part interesting me the most in this field. And in this talk, I would like mainly focus on the behavior part, to talk about how people find out their control and how they use their control to interact with the world. And like there are 3 approaches I have been taking to study the interest of my interest in this field. The first approach is the individual difference approach, and we test the sensitivity in detecting control, how people find out how well people find out they have control over the world, the external world or not, and how are those individual difference connected, linked to people with different control, different abilities to control. And the second approach is action analyze, and we examined how people actively collect information regarding their control in the environment by changing their actions. And the third approach is trying to use a computational model, the cue integration model, to explain when we have multiple cues, why some people feel in control, but some others do not. And I'd like to extend those 3 approaches one by one. And sorry, before entering those studies, I would like to briefly introduce our paradigm. You will see this dot paradigm in many of my slides. And please first look at the right side. And usually I display, I ask people to move, to perform 2-dimension two-dimensional movement, like moving a mouse on a table or moving the fingers on a touchpad, so that we can acquire like X and Y movement from each frame, from each time point. And in my task, I usually mix participants' real-time two-dimensional movement with a series of pre-recorded movement. How we do that is as follows, because for example, if we have someone move their mouse like to the right side for like 5 pixels and then upside to for 10 pixels, then we can calculate the direction by those two by the shift on those two axes. And we also have a lot of pre-recorded motions which were performed by a human. And so it looks very natural. The pre-recorded movement also looks quite natural and continuous. And we randomly choose a section, not random motions, separated motion, but a continuous section. And we use one of we use the motions from the section one by one. And first we choose one motion which has an angle. And we combine those two angles with a certain ratio. For example, if someone, if in a condition, we would like to generate a motion under 80% of control, we use 80% of someone's own moving angle and plus 20% of the pre-recorded moving angle, and combine them to generate a displayed motion on the screen. And now we have the moving direction, and the magnitude of the movement was always equalized to the real-time mouse movement. So when people start to move the mouse, people see the dot moving, start to move on the screen. When they stop, the dot also stop. When they move very fast, the dot will always move fast. The temporal cue is not useful for them to make judgment to detect whether they have control over the dot or not, but they have to focus on the spatial pattern. And using that task, for example, what we have done is that we ask people to choose between two objects or among several objects, which one they think they have control over the object. The logic is that if you have sensitive ability to detect your control among multiple objects, you should be able to gain quite high accuracy, even when the level of actual control is very low. So this is if we have different conditions with different actual levels of control, we can plot those type of psychometric curve and try to find out where the threshold comes. And to compare among participants, we can analyze the individual difference in the sensitivity. And also among those like signal, among the detection accuracy, we can also use signal detection theory and also use the law of the logistic curve, and also like I just mentioned, that cutoff point to use different perspectives to measure the sensitivity of control. And about the individual difference approach, the first one, like the previous one I have done was, I've done this study with Professor Imamitsu in the University of Tokyo and his student. And what we have done is that we ask people to detect an increase or a decrease in control when they move the dot, when they continuously move the dot. And in the whole task, we have a lot of trials. In half of them, the control did not change. It always stayed in an initial level. And in the other half, the control increased or decreased, depending on the blocks. And in the increased block, the control started from 0%. So when people move the mouse, the dot start to move, but the direction was completely different from the way they moved the mouse. And after a random duration, the control start to increase like every time by 10%. And people had to press a key on the keyboard to say to to report once they have noticed that there was a change. And there was a point, reward or punishment to prevent people from like just pressing the response key even when they do not notice anything, or to press the key too late until they become very sure about the change. They have to press the key as early as possible, but they have to be very sure about the change. There was the instruction. And in the decrease block, people had to report a change when this control started from 100% but decreased slowly. And there were, we took the point when people, the average point when people reported a change as the index of sensitivity to a change in control. And also we measured the ability of motor adaptation to see how fast people could adapt to an angular bias. Again, there's a huge individual differences in motor learning, and some people are very good at motor adaptation, but some people are not that good. And first about the sensitivity to a change in control, what we have found was that indeed there were a lot of individual differences in both the judgment of decrease in control and the judgment for an increase in control. And when we plot the histograms of increase and decrease response point, we notice that the individual difference for detecting an increase in control was much larger than the detection of a decrease in control. It means that like people, most of the participants were quite sensitive to a decrease in control. When the control decreased about 20%, then most of them just already pressed the key. But for an increase of control, there's a huge variety there, variance there. And like some people start to report, they notice the increase from like 40%, but some people need to be sure until the control increase to 80%. And then we pull all those individual data. Sorry, there's one more slide I have to introduce here. About the motor learning, we had 4 trials, 4 very long trials, 200 seconds per trial. Ask people to move a dot to reach a cross, to touch a cross as much as possible, and the cross just keep on moving on the screen. And we calculated how many times they could touch the cross in every 20-second time window. And because there were either negative minus 90-degree angular bias or plus 90-degree angular bias, at the first time window, it was quite hard for people to touch a lot because of the large angular bias, but people get used to that quickly. You can see the performance increase along the time window, and we use the slope of this learning curve as efficiency of motor learning. And in addition, as you can see that when the same angular bias was presented for the second time, the initial motor control performance was already better than the first time. So there was also an effect of repeat. We pull those 2 sensitivities to control increase into an structural equation model to see how those sensitivity, individual difference in sensitivity could contribute or could correlate with motor learning efficiency. This model is basically based on regression. And if you see 2 arrows pointing to this box, then there was a linear regression formula with 2 independent variables with 1 dependent variable. And the model just put all the data in it and try to estimate the best parameters for or the data to see if the data could match the model very well. And we had quite good model fit. And what we found, the most important finding from this modeling is that we found that only the perceptual sensitivity to control increase significantly contributed to motor learning efficiency. But of course, this is not a causal relationship. It is based on correlations and assumptions. And at least we can see that detecting the increase in control in the environment seems closely linked to the ability to adapt a disturbance or in the environment to gain better control. On the other hand, the ability to detect a decrease in control at very early stage did not correlate to the motor learning ability. And therefore, we say like one main conclusion from this study is that detecting control instead of detecting the losing of control seems more important for motor learning. And also those two detections might have different underlying mechanisms which need to be further examined in future study. And the second study we have done is to use a developmental approach to again study the individual difference. We have many children from different age groups. Many of them have actually had they have a lot of awareness in motor development, sorry. And like the clinical test for this motor development is called manual dexterity test to measure how well they can perform this task, which requires like very precise motor control. And the task was designed for different age groups, and the score was standardized for different age groups. And beside this motor task, all those children they performed the control detection task. They have to say which dots they could control after moving the dot, after moving a mouse for 10 seconds. It's very long compared to the task used in adult. And what we have found that again for we have a lot of psychometric curves here for different age groups. And we can see that for most of the age groups, the curves look very similar. But only for the age group of 5 to 6 years, we see a large drop in the detection accuracy. And we put the threshold cutoff point to 66% because they were asked to choose one dot among 3, and the chance level was at 33%. So we choose the center point between the chance level and the maximum performance. And then we use the cutoff point is called regularity detection threshold, RDT, and was in the group of 5 to 6 year old. And there was a overall significant correlation between the regularity detection threshold and age. And but if we focus on 5 to 6 years old group, we can see that there was a very strong, quite strong correlation between the manual dexterity and the detection threshold. And the children who were who had quite poor control, they could who were very bad at controlling their fingers to perform very precise tasks, they will actually they also performed quite early in the dot detection task, and which means that again this finding supported our hypothesis that the detection of control in the environment, it might be closely linked to the ability of motor control. And this is still an ongoing task that we are trying to, we are also using this task the dot task to measure children with developmental disorders. And for the second approach, we focused on how people move the mouse. Like it's not only about how fast you move or like how often you move. It's also the patterns that people make is very important for this task. And like in previous research, we couldn't really perform any analysis on the patterns because the pattern is very high dimensional, and it's really hard to give quantitative measures for those patterns of movement. And like in this study, many of you might know this person, Dr. Asa Chang. He has been working in the area for a few years, and now we are working together on this project. What we have done is that we again used the dot task. In the self-recognition task, we ask people to move the dot for 5 seconds. Then we ask them to make a yes/no judgment to say whether they control the movement of the moving direction of the dot. It's a type of control recognition task. People have to perform recognizable patterns to get the information, then to correctly making the judgment whether yes they had control or no, they do not really have control. So if someone is very biased to always answer yes, we will be able to see a huge amount of a large proportion of yes response. But if people are able to make correct judgment, we could see the effect. We could see clear effect of manipulations of the actual control on the judgment. Here we had 6 levels, 6 different experimental conditions, including 3 levels of control: 30%, 50%, and 80%, and 2 types of angular bias. And 0-degree angular bias means that the real-time mouse motion was just mixed with the pre-recorded movement. For the 90% for the 90-degree angular bias means that displayed the combined motion was rotated for 90 degrees after the calculation. And for the control detection task, which was similar to the one used in the developmental study. And we asked people to move the mouse for 5 seconds, then they had to select 1 dot among 3 to say which dot they had control. And this task required people to not only recognize their own control, but have to discriminate themselves from others. And it's also like a bottom-up process, because people have 3 dots at the same time, and they have to allocate attention according to the sensory input quickly enough in 5 seconds. And for this task, we had 50 participants in total, including 25 healthy participant and 25 schizophrenia patient. And patient with schizophrenia, they are known to have symptoms in feeling that someone else is controlling their actions or their thought, or they could control something in the environment which is not controlled by them. So they have a type of weird beliefs, and also some of them here
like someone talking in their head, but actually that could just be their inner speech. And many previous studies also showed that patient with schizophrenia, they perform differently in agency judgment. Some studies show that they have strong belief about the agency, but some others show that they are very bad at detecting this agency. They don't notice that they already have control over an event, external event. But it remains remains unclear whether the actions they choose to do has any effect on their sense of agency. And for this task, first, I'd like to report the accuracy result. And for the one dot task, when people had to answer whether they had control over the dot, actually, like surprisingly, there was no difference between the healthy controls and the patient group. And as I mentioned, that there were 3 levels of actual control and 2 levels of angular bias. For the blue line represent 0 degree angular bias, which is the easy condition. And when in this condition, in this 0 degree angular bias, you can see that when the actual control increased, the proportion of yes response also increased in both the healthy controls and patient. And when there was a rotation, 90-degree rotation, it makes it hard to recognize their own movement. And both the healthy controls and patients showed a large drop in the yes response. So, especially for patients, they don't really seem, at least in this task, to have a strange belief. They could recognize their own motions and also correctly decline the motions that do not look like their own mouse movement. But for the control detection task, there was a significant difference between the 2 groups. On overall, patients show significantly lower accuracies in all those conditions. But in this, we are writing a paper to discuss this task performance to discuss the difference in task performance among between these 2 groups. But in this talk, I'm not going to talk too much about the performance, but I'd like to focus on the way healthy controls move the mouse and how different patients use their movement to do this task. And here are some examples of how people move the mouse. And the colors represent the timeline. And people always start from the red diamond shape, and they move the mouse on the 2-dimensional space. And as you can see, that people are making different patterns, and there are very different strategies they move. But it seems that they somehow try to collect information about how similar the spatial patterns on the screen look as their own mouse movement patterns. And the problem here is that how we could measure the different patterns and how we could collect information about whether people, how much information could people gather from changing their moving plans. And what we have done is basically Dr. Chang's work, and what he has done is to use autoencoder to let's say to compress the high dimensional moment into a lower dimensional actual space. And the encoder has to ensure that this lower dimensional action space could successfully recover all those motions. And what he has done is that he used the slide time windows of 1 second, like each time windows 1 second, and which contains 60 frames. And he moved the time window along the line 1 frame by 1 frame. So the hidden layer, the bottleneck, is called action plan space, contains the information, the information of the movement in this 1 second time window in a lower dimensional space. And if we try to visualize this action plan space, which is actually 60 dimension, but we try to visualize this in 3 dimensions. And as you can see, when this light window moves along the timeline, the position of 1 second movement in those action plan slightly moved in this space. And if we want to compare 2 different moving patterns, like to see how similar they were, and or to compare the dynamics, how they changed, how different, like how rapidly they changed from the previous movement, we can first calculate the distance of 2 actions in this space. Just use this distance could provide the measures of how different 2 1 second actions look like. And also we can compare the changes in from the previous time point to see how the dynamics could differ between 2 actions. And with these 2 types of calculation, we actually could answer multiple questions. Like the first one, we could check how well action plans could predict the control detection actions if we have all those mouse movement and the displayed movement on the screen recorded. If we just use a algorithm to compare the motion people had performed with the motion displayed on the screen, can we successfully guess which dot participant would choose? And also we could also calculate in the 1 dot task whether people would say a yes, whether they could recognize the dot displayed movement on the screen by comparing the movement on the screen with the actual mouse movement, and to estimate people's response. And those number 1 and number 2 could be done just using the recorded motions without considering people's judgment bias or the attention allocations. And for the third one, we focus on how diverse the action plan was for each participant. And some people may have very like different high dimensional action space. Let's say they have very different action plans. Sometimes they choose to perform a circle, and sometimes they might change it to draw straight lines to recognize or to recognize the dot, their own movement on the screen, or to detect the target from among 3 objects. And for the first research question, we examined if the actions and the displayed movement was sufficient to detect which dot participant would choose from the screen. What we have done is to compare the mouse movement with the displayed motion. I'm sorry for the text on this in the center. We just moved it by mistake. And like here, you see the upper panel, the x-axis, you can assume that x-axis timeline, and the y-axis is the distance between the displayed movement and someone's actual mouse movement, because there were 3 dots in the control detection task, which showed here. We have 3 distance plotting here. When the time window slide along the timeline, you can see sometimes the the difference in distance among those three dots oscillate. But in this chart, this is just example of one chart. We can see that dot one was always had the minimum, the closest distance difference from the mouse movement. So it's quite easy to say for the algorithm to estimate that dot one was probably the target dot that someone may choose. And also this calculation could be done in the same way for the dynamics, and combine the distance and dynamics, we could use an algorithm to calculate from the way people move the mouse and the dots they have seen to guess which dot one like participant could have chosen in each trial. And after simulation, we could compare the predicted accuracy with actual accuracy to see how well the actions could predict people's control detection. And for healthy control group, the correlation between the predicted accuracy and the actual accuracy was quite high. And that means that the action plan, the action people performed actually contains rich information about how well they could detect the target dot. But for patient group, the correlation was lower, but still significant. This result shows that patient action did not fully contain all the informations we need to detect the target dot. They might have other strategies to detect which dots they have control over, and which needs further examined in future study. And for the one dot task, and we focus on how well people can recognize the motion of the dot, whether to make the correct judgment according to the way they have moved the mouse. And because there's just one dot, and this both the sensitivity and the criterion, people would answer yes or no. So the way Lisa did was to use a logistic fitting and leave one out, weighted logistic regression to use. We had 60 trials in total for this task. He used 59 trials to fit the logistic curve to the response, and then leave one out to predict whether people would give a yes response or no response for the left trial. And he repeated this for 59 trials, 60 times to predict whether our algorithm would say this dot could be recognized or not. And the result showed very high correlations between the predicted response and the actual response for both the healthy group and the patient group, which means that to recognize someone's movement on the screen and the way people moved the mouse was already sufficient to provide all the information people would say yes or no. And last, for the question how people would change the action plans to detect the movement on the screen or to recognize the target, we analyze the action diversity. And action diversity, you can understand it as the richness of sensory evidence. When you have a very diverse action, means that people have a huge, like people already have a large choice in their mind about how they move the mouse, and they switch among them to get the information. If they use one action plan and already gather sufficient information, then if they switch to a different action plan, then they could have new information for their judgment, which would be very helpful for them to detect their control in the environment. And what we have done is that we perform for those already encoded 60 16-dimensional action space, we perform principal component analysis to sort the like the most strong influential factor from like from larger influence to smaller influence, and then we fit this distribution and to calculate the index of the parameter of lambda. Lambda represent how sharp those principal the contribution of the principal component job. So the larger lambda is means that the less diverse the 16 dimensions are. So we use the value 1 minus lambda to as the index of action diversity. And again, we calculated action diversity only from the way people move the mouse for the 1-dot task and the 3-dot task for both healthy controls and patient. And what we found is that first, as you can see from both panels, patients showed much lower action diversities, and they like the sorry. And the second finding was that as you can see that the lines here somehow differed according to the conditions. The x-axis was the actual level of control, and the different colors represent angular bias. For healthy controls, you can see the action diversity was lower when the actual control was low, and it was also lower when there was a rotation there, so it's hard to recognize their control, but it's higher when in the conditions when the control was easier to recognize, which means that people might switch their action plans or change their action plans to get more information once they have recognized their control in the environment. So in other words, healthy controls was actively using their actions to gather information for the judgment of for the detection of control. And once they have recognized it. But on the other hand, there was no effect of the actual control on action diversities for patient group. It means that the patient did not exhibit any changes in the exploration actions based on the levels, based on the level of control in the environment. And you might recall that in the 1-dot task, patient did not show a significant different sense of agency from the healthy controls. Means that they know whether they had control over the dot, but they just didn't really change the way they move the mouse, and that might have resulted in poor task performance in the 3-dot task when the task was more difficult and when there were multiple sensory input requiring them to use the sensory information to make the judgment. And to sum up this study, we found that sense of agency is formed from active inference, including both pattern creation behaviors and dynamic changes of action plan. And only use the action plans we could quite accurately estimate how people make judgment about the sense of agency. And second, we also found that at least in healthy groups, sense of agency increased the diversities of exploring actions, because this like when people feel in control and change the action plans help them to further confirm, to further gather more information regarding whether their feelings or their sense are correct or not. And at last, after testing patients with schizophrenia, we found out that they show very low action diversities when explore their controls in a very simple behavior task. And they also did not adjust their actions based on the level of actual control in the environment. Okay, and at last, I would like to introduce our computational modeling work, which is about the Q integrations. And as I think you all know that there's a series of Bayesian estimation that assume all our perceptions or sensories is a result of Bayesian estimation, and the brain itself is a huge prediction machine. We keep on updating our models about the world, and then when we have new sensory input, we make decisions according to the prime distributions of these sensories, and also we update the prime distributions continuously. And this is also quite a useful framework for understanding how people would feel about the sense of when they have different cues and in the environment. For example, the cues whether they achieve a goal, or the cue whether the dot moved in the exact direction they have moved. And this Bayesian frameworks has also been proved to be useful to understand like intentional binding effect, like how much the effect they could be shifted to the time point when an action occurred, and how the probability of the event could affect this shift. And I'm not going to go through all those details of the previous study, but I'd like to mention another Q integration model we proposed before. And like in our previous review paper, we suggest that like at least for different cues from sensory motor level and cognitive levels, they should be integrated with certain weightings at each group. And the weightings in this model, we suggest that it might depend on the like the reliability, or let's say the variance in the sensory input. Like if the sensory input has large variance, means that is less reliable and might have smaller weightings in the integration. But this when we proposed this model, we did not really have the data to support it, and then we designed a task actually to test this model and to provide better computational explanations of different Q integrations. In this task, as you can see in this video, and people pushed a joystick and to trigger the movement of a dot toward a target, and the target was a small line moving on the curve. And the task was participants were asked to aim to the center of the moving line, because the line was moving, and so it's quite hard to make sure that every child can hit the center. And actually, whether the dot could hit the center of the line or not was manipulated independently from how, like which direction people pushed the joystick. There was two independent variables in this task. The first one is called proximal error. We had 5 different conditions. This is a difference in angle between the actual joystick angle and the presented trajectories. And when there was no arrow, means when the arrow was 0 degree, means that the dots just went in the exact direction that participant pushed the joystick. And there was another arrow called goal-related arrow, which was manipulated by moving this this line, this target, the position of the target. So after we like calculate in which direction the dot should be launched, and then we move the short line to make sure to create different conditions, like how large the difference between the finally launched angle and the center of the goal. And when the difference is larger here, means that the dot was away from the goal, and when the goal related arrow is 0, means that the line comes exactly to the center of the dot, and people would feel that they hit the goal even but if this happens when the proximal arrow was huge, people would feel that well, they hit the goal, but the dot went to a different direction from the way they push the joystick. It's a complicated judgment, might be a complicated judgment for them, because they have different cues, proximal arrow and goal related arrow, and they have to say how much, whether they feel that they have control over the launching direction of the dot. And we had 25 conditions. In total, there was 115 trials. And like this is the plot of each individual, like how well, like how much they use the goal related arrow and the proximal arrow to make the agency judgment. And as you can see, that proximal arrow actually had larger weightings for most of the participants, means that when the difference between the joystick angle and the dot moving angle was large, people did not really feel in control with over the dot moving direction, which makes sense. And but in some of the participants, you can see that the weighting for the proximal arrow was smaller than the weighting for the goal related arrow. Means that once they hit the center of the line, they might be quite satisfied and thought they have good control over the dot. And like this is the type of individual difference, how people weight the two different types of cues. And we are not going to conclude that all people do the same, but we would like to say that the people integrate the two cues in a similar, under a similar framework. But the framework, this integration could vary depending on the variance of input of the sensory input. And another feature, like individual difference in the judgment is that the decision boundary has agency rating, and you can see how many times people have rated for higher good sense of vision and poor sense of vision. And for this participant, you can see that like all those judgment was quite ambiguous, and this person did not really have clear boundary of whether they had good control or not. And for some other participants, you can see that the agency rating was quite extreme, and this person is very clear when he or she has good control over the dot or not. And this is also, we were also quite interested in how we could explain this individual difference in with parameters, how people integrate the different cues. And like the framework we have used is quite simple. It's just spatial inference. And first we assume that there's a self who launched the dot, and there's a non-self, means the computer might have launched the dot. And when you see the input, for example, when you see a direction of the movement, you could use the distribution to estimate how, like estimate the probability of when you see the dot movement, how possible it is yourself using this Bayesian calculation formula. And this could be done for both cues. And we just simply multiply the two cues. and to extend this formula and then plot them into this three-dimensional space, and the two x and y dimensions represent the two cues, proximal errors and goal-related errors, and the z-axis present the probability of self causing this movement. And then, as you can see, that we have to assume that the distribution of the two types of cues. How variant can the input possibly be? And just need to remind you about the design, that we actually had 5 different conditions for the both the proximal errors and goal-related errors. Means that both input are quite variant. And then for the simulation, we changed the variance, the sigma of those two cues, and use the different values between 1 and 3. And here, then we have different densities of self-attribution under different conditions. This is not from actual data, it's just a simulation using this formula, and by changing the variance of the two different cues, so we can see that when the variance of two different cues changed, the self-attribution, the density of self-attribution also changed among people. And we would like to contribute, this is the simulation when we change the variance of Q number 1, and then we also could change the Q for number 2. And then we can plot the proximal error with the goal-related errors to see how much people would put different weight for the two different cues. And when we change to the sigma 1 and sigma 2, we could generate different dots to represent different weightings for let's say different samples. And then we can see this shape is quite similar as what we had got, this 26 different individuals. And for the 26 different individuals, like the weightings they put on the different the two types of cues also vary a lot among them. And but you can see this is straight. They're very close to a straight line, means that the two cues are probably integrated in a multiplication fashion, and which was similar as our estimation. And again, when we vary the variance of the two sensory input, we can again see a similar result as the actual behavior result. Some people show quite clear boundaries in agency judgment. They give very clear response whether the dot was launched by themselves or not. And some people show quite non-clear boundaries. There was no clear boundaries between self and non-self judgment, which this is actually a result of like noise levels in the input. What we can say that agent with low noise levels show sharper decision boundaries, while agent with high noise levels show narrow distributions. And these estimations, these computational frameworks provide quite useful tool to understand the individual difference in how people integrate two cues. What we can say that people probably integrate these two cues and put in different weightings for them according to the variance in the sensory input. And a simple Bayesian inference model could explain the very unique individual profiles in agency judgment with multiple cues. And for this study, we only have 2 cues, but we believe that this framework can be extended to multiple cues when for agency judgment. And people probably people may implicitly have an internal model about the environment and then calculate the likelihood of whether an event is caused by themselves or the environment. And well, and to sum up all the three approaches we have done for the research on sense of agency, and I would like to propose some take-home messages. And for the findings from individual difference approach, we found that there are large individual difference in detecting control, but not in detecting losing of control. And actually, we are also working on the neural basis underlying those individual difference to see why like detecting losing control is so different from detecting control in the environment. Like in classic models, they should be computed with the same signals, but actually it seems that's not the case for like from the performance result. And also we found that those individual difference in detecting control in the environment are likely to be linked to motor learning and motor development. And from the action analysis approach, we found that control affects people. The most important finding is that control affect action diversities, and people change their action plans to get more information from the environment and to explore their control and to detect their control and to further confirm to test the hypothesis about the control. And this actually inference is also reflecting the role of how sense of agency would shape our actions. And also the way to study one's action might provide rich information regarding how people feel their control over the environment. But this is the this might be noisy, but it could be potentially quite subjective to study this quite object to study this subject feeling. Right. And the last the findings from the Q integration study is that we found a very simple Bayesian inference model could help us to understand how people integrate different cues and to make their to form a sense of agency. And as I mentioned, that there are large individual difference in the weightings people put, and this individual difference could be simply explained by the variance in the model people already formed for the environment. Okay, that's all of my talk, and thank you for your attention. And for Zoom talk, it's very quiet, and I'm not really quite used to it. And please feel free to contact me if you have any question or suggestions. And you can find me at my email address and also my website. And I would like also to thank my the fundings which provide money for those studies. And this is a photo of my new campus. Like from my office, I can see Sakura when I moved into this office, and a huge ground, and people, like students, always practice from early morning. And that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you very much.